Hi, it's a book traveller again, still in Manchester, and ready to read another couple of chapters, final two chapters, in fact, of The Wager. But I just thought I'd just show you this um, design work here above my bed in the hotel room here, um, indicative of the old cotton works that adorned many a street in Manchester in the early 1900s, late 1800s, all manner of clothing and cotton works and silk works here. And in fact, the hotel I'm staying in is a refurbished cotton mill. All the goods transported along the Manchester Ship Canal. I just think this is a really lovely piece to indicate some of the history of Manchester. But I really love coming back to Manchester because there's so much more going on here. The rejuvenation of the city over the past few years has been awesome, and everywhere you can look, you can see new development amongst some of the old um, buildings of the city itself. So I've already shown you some of these out here with Victoria Station down below. And if I can just squeeze around the corner, if you look right down beneath there, you can see just these buildings over here, all attached next to the Manchester Cathedral, just behind it. We can't see that there, but really old style, lovely buildings and houses there, with the backdrop of new city scrapers shooting up everywhere you look around Manchester. A really lovely developing city, if I'm a little bit biased as well, and more over my left shoulder as well. But absolutely brilliant place. If you ever get the chance to visit Manchester, then there's something for everyone, literally, to come and enjoy the city. So I shall sit back down, and there you can see, if I look that way, there's Strange Ways again. Remember, talked about the prison. The other thing I didn't mention about Strange Ways is one of the few prisons that used to run its own brewery, which was really good. Prisoners could work in there, and they would brew a very famous bitter called Boddington's, which is still available to purchase. And everywhere you look in Manchester, you will see Manchester's logo of the Manchester Bee, indicating the workers, and Boddington's brewery has the logo of the bee. It's the yellow colour of Manchester with a black bee, black and yellow, and it's a really, really lovely logo that's carried through the city itself everywhere you look. Anyway, let's get on with this book, chapter 25 of The Wager, and it is called The Court Martial. So now we're going to find out what's going to happen to the survivors of The Wager. On April 15th, 1746, a Union Jack flag was hoisted atop one of the Prince George's masts and a cannon fired. The court martial was beginning. The sea novelist Frederick Marryat, who entered the Royal Navy in 1806 at the age of 14 and rose to captain, once wrote that the pomp of such proceedings was calculated to strike the mind with awe even of a captain himself. He added, the ship is arranged with the greatest nicety. Her decks are as white as snow, and her hammocks are stowed with care. Her ropes are taut, her yards square, her guns run out, and a guard of marines under the orders of a lieutenant prepare to receive every member of the court with the honour due to his rank. The great cabin is prepared with a long table covered with a green cloth. Pens, ink, paper, prayer books, and the articles of war are laid round to every member. The 13 judges assigned to the wager trial appeared on the deck in their formal dress. All were officers of high rank. Captains and commodores, and the lead judge, the so-called president, was Sir James Stewart, nearly 70-year-old vice-admiral, who was commander-in-chief of all His Majesty's ships at Portsmouth. These men clearly seemed more like peers of Cheap rather than of Bulkeley and his followers, yet judges were known to punish a fellow officer. In 1757, Admiral John Byng would be executed after being found guilty of failing to do his utmost during battle, prompting Voltaire to remark in Candide that the English believed it proper to kill an admiral from time to time in order to encourage the others. Stewart sat at the head of the table, and the other judges placed themselves on either side of him in a descending order of seniority. The judges were sworn to uphold their duty to administer justice without favour or affection. The prosecutor was present, and so was a judge advocate who helped to run the tribunal and provide its members with legal advice. George Anson was not there, but a year earlier, during his steady ascent through the ranks, he had been appointed to the powerful Board of the Admiralty, which oversaw the general policy of naval discipline, and he undoubtedly had a deep interest in the proceedings involving his former men, especially his protege Cheap. Over the years, Anson had proven an astute judge of character, and many of the men in the squadron whom he promoted would go on to become some of the most illustrious commanders of the Navy, among them the Centurion's Lieutenant Charles Saunders, the midshipman Augustus Keppel, and the Severn's midshipman Richard Howe, but the man Anson had chosen to command the Wager was at risk of being convicted as a murderer. Cheap had earlier sent Anson a letter congratulating him on his victory over the Caledonia and the promotions you'd so justly deserve in the opinion of all mankind, he wrote. I take the liberty to assure you that no man on earth wishes your prosperity with a warmer heart than I do, and then added, I must beg your favour and protection, which I flatter myself I shall have whilst I behave myself as I ought, and when I behave otherwise I shall expect neither. Anson told a relative of Cheap that he remained supportive of his former lieutenant. Cheap and the other defendants were brought in to face the court. As then customary, they were not represented by attorneys. They had to defend themselves. But they could receive legal advice from the court or a colleague. Crucially, they would call and cross-examine witnesses. Prior to the hearing, each defendant had been required to give a statement of facts, which was then presented into evidence. When Bulkeley was called to record his, he protested that he still did not know exactly what charges were being filed against him. Ever conscious of his rights, he said, I always thought, or at least the laws of my country tell me, that when a man is a prisoner he must be accused. Bulkeley complained that he had no way to properly prepare a defence. He was told that at that moment he simply needed to provide a deposition on the cause of the shipwreck. Whenever one of His Majesty's ships was lost, an inquiry was held to determine if any of the officers or crew were responsible. Now, as the trial began, Cheap was the first to answer questions on the limited matter regarding the wrecking of the Wager. He levelled just one accusation, that Lieutenant Baines had been derelict in his duties by, among other things, failing to inform him that the carpenter, Cummins, had reported seeing land the day before the ship struck the rocks. A judge asked Cheap, do you charge any officer besides the lieutenant with being in any degree accessory to the loss of the Wager? No, sir, I acquit them all of that, he replied. He was not pressed on his other allegations, and before long it was Bulkeley's turn. He, too, was interrogated, only about the loss of the Wager. A judge asked him why, before the ship ran aground, he had not tried with others to release its anchor. The cable was foul, Bulkeley replied. Have you anything to object to the conduct of the captain or officers, or to its proceedings in all respects for the good and preservation of the ship and crew? Bulkeley had already answered this question by publishing his journal. In those pages he had pointedly blamed Cheap for the wreck, alleging that the captain had refused to alter the course out of stubbornness and a blind obedience to orders. These temperamental shortcomings, Bulkeley believed, had only worsened during the tempestuous interlude on the island, fueling the mayhem and culminating with Cheap's committing murder and his ouster from power. Yet now, as Bulkeley spoke before the 13 judges, he seemed to sense that something about the legal proceedings was fundamentally amiss. He had not been charged with mutiny, or indeed with anything at all. It was as if there being offered an unspoken bargain, and so Bulkeley thought he had given an oath to tell the truth, and was not one to hold his tongue, decided to leave some things unspoken as well. I can lay nothing to the charge of any officer, he said. Thus it went. The carpenter Cummins, considered one of the ringleaders of the mutiny, was asked, have you anything to lay to the charge of the captain or any of the officers for neglecting preservation of the ship? No, he replied, passing over the fact that he had once accused Cheap directly to his face of causing the wreck, not to mention having called him a murderer in print. The boatswain King was summoned. He had been among the unruliest castaways. He had stolen liquor and officers' clothing, and during the rebellion he had physically assaulted Cheap. But King was not brought up on a single charge and was simply asked, have you anything to say against your captain for the loss of the ship? No, the captain behaved very well. I have nothing to say against him or any other officer. When it was John Byron's turn, he was not asked about any of the horrors he had witnessed, those dark acts that he had learned men, supposed gentlemen, were capable of. After a few technical questions about the ship's operation, he was dismissed. Lieutenant Baines was the only one facing any accusation whatsoever. He insisted that he had not reported the sighting of land to Cheap because he had thought it was no more than a speck of clouds on the horizon. Otherwise, I would have certainly told the captain, he said. After a brief adjournment, the court returned. It had reached a unanimous verdict. A paper was handed to the judge advocate, who read the decision aloud, that Captain David Cheap had done his duty, and used all means in his power to have preserved His Majesty's ship Wager under his command. All the other officers and crew were also absolved on this count, except for Baines, who received a mere reprimand. Bulkeley was overjoyed by the verdict. He boasted that he had been honourably acquitted, and declared, "In this day's proceedings we had beheld the great and glorious power of the Almighty in pleading our cause, and defending us from falling by the violence of men." Cheap must have been alerted beforehand of the court's limited focus, for he never pressed his allegations against Bulkeley and his men. Though Cheap was denied his long-sought retribution, he too had been spared any punishment. He hadn't even been stripped of his cherished title of captain. There were no further proceedings, no adjudication of whether Cheap had been guilty of murder, or whether Bulkeley and his followers had mutinied and attempted to kill their commander. There was not even a hearing on whether any of the men had been guilty of desertion or quarrelling with a superior officer. The British authorities, it seemed, didn't want either side's story to prevail, and to justify this outcome they relied on a murky facet of the regulations, because naval rules stated that, after a shipwreck, the seamen on board were no longer entitled to wages. The castaways might have assumed that they were not subject to naval law on the island. Yet this bureaucratic reasoning, which the historian Glendower Williams called an escape clause, boldly ignored an addendum to the rule. If seamen were still able to procure supplies from a wreck, then they continued to be on the Navy's payroll. C.H. Lehman, the British Rear Admiral and an authority on the Wager case, later concluded there was an uncomfortable whiff of justification in the Admiralty's decision not to prosecute a conspicuous mutiny. It is impossible to know for sure what transpired behind the scenes, but there were certainly reasons for the Admiralty to want the case to disappear. Ferreting out and documenting all the incontrovertible facts of what had happened on the island, the marauding, the stealing, the whippings, the murders, who would have undercut the central claim on which the British Empire tried to justify its role of other peoples, namely that its imperial forces, its civilization, were inherently superior, that its officers were gentlemen, not brutes. Moreover, a proper trial would have offered an unwelcome reminder that the War of Jenkins' Ear had been a calamity, another ignoble chapter in the long, grim history of nations sending their troops off on ill-conceived, poorly funded, bungled military adventures. 5 years before the court-martial, Admiral Vernon had led, as planned, Britain's massive assault with nearly 200 ships on the South American city of Cartagena. But plagued by mismanagement, infighting between military leaders, and the constant menace of yellow fever, the siege had resulted in the loss of more than 10,000 men. After 67 days of failing to capture the city, Vernon declared to his surviving crew that they were surrounded with the toils of death. He then ordered a humiliating retreat. Even Anson's expedition, with its vaunted haul of treasure, had largely been a catastrophe. Of the nearly 2,000 men who had set sail, more than 1,300 had perished, a shocking death rate even for such a long voyage. And though Anson had returned with some £400,000 worth of booty, the war had cost the taxpayers £43 million. One British newspaper had dissented from the celebrations of Anson's victory by publishing a poem. Deluded Britons, wherefore should you boast of treasure purchased at a treble cost? Will this, while centering in a private hand, restore to wealth your much impoverished land? To purchase this, think how much treasure's gone. Think on the mighty mischiefs its bath done, of Albion's son unprofitably lost. Then will your boastings into sorrow turn. Not only had British men and boys been sent to their death, but the war itself had been rooted at least partly in a deception. The merchant captain Robert Jenkins had indeed been attacked by the Spanish, but this had occurred in 1731, 8 years before the outbreak of the war. The incident had originally drawn little attention and was forgotten until British politicians' business interests clamouring for war dredged it up. In 1738, when Jenkins was summoned to testify before the House of Commons, it was widely reported afterward that he had held up his ear in a jar of brine and delivered his rousing remarks about sacrificing himself for his country. But though he was certainly called to testify, no transcript exists of what occurred, and some historians have suggested that he was out of the country at the time. British political and economic interests had their own ulterior motivations for war. Although English merchants had been widely prevented from trading in Spanish-controlled ports in Latin America, they had found a sinister way. In 1713, the British South Sea Company had received from Spain what was known as nacimiento, a license to sell nearly 5,000 African people a year as slaves in Spain's Latin American colonies. Because of this abhorrent new agreement, the English merchants were able to use their ships to smuggle such goods as sugar and wool. As the Spanish increasingly retaliated by seizing vessels that sold forbidden goods, British merchants and their political allies began searching for a pretext to rally the public for war, to expand Britain's colonial holdings and monopolies on trade. And the fable of Jenkins' ear, as Admin Burke later dubbed it, provided a righteous sheen to their scheme. The historian David Olusogo had noted that the unseemly aspects of the war's origin have largely been expunged from the mainstream narrative of British history. By the time the Wager court-martial, the stalemated War of Jenkins' Ear had already been subsumed into another, wider, imperial struggle known as the War of the Austrian Succession, in which all the European powers were jockeying for dominance. Over the next several decades, British naval victories would transform the small island nation into an empire with maritime supremacy, what the poet James Thomson called an empire of the deep. By the early 1900s, Great Britain had become the largest empire in history, ruling over 400 million people and a quarter of the Earth's landmass. But in 1746, the government was preoccupied with maintaining public support after so many dreadful losses. A mutiny, especially in times of war, can be so threatening, so established order that it is not even officially recognized as one. During the First World War, French troops in various units on the Western Front refused to fight in one of the largest mutinies in history, but the government's official account described the incident merely as disturbances and the rectification of morale. The military records were sealed for 50 years, and it wasn't until 1967 that an authoritative account was published in France. The official inquiry into the Wager affair was permanently closed. Cheap's deposition detailing his allegations eventually disappeared from the court-martial files, and the upheaval on Wager Island became, in the words of Gluinda Williams, the mutiny that never was. Chapter 26. The version that won. Lost amid the controversy over the Wager affair was the story of another mutiny, one witnessed by the very last castaways to straggle home. 3 months after the court-martial, 3 long-lost crew members from Bulkeley's party, including the midshipman Isaac Morris, astonishingly arrived on a ship in Portsmouth. It had been more than 4 years since these men had swum ashore in Patagonia with a small party from the Speedwell to gather provisions, only to be left behind on the beach. Bulkeley and other survivors on board the boat had told their version of what had happened. The stormy seas and a broken rudder had made it impossible for them to steer close enough to the coast to retrieve the men. After Bulkeley's crew had sent ashore a barrel filled with some munitions and an explanatory note, Morris and his companions, watching the Speedwell sail away, had sunk to their knees. Morris later called their desertion the greatest act of cruelty. At the time, Morris's group had included 7 other men. They'd already been castaways for 8 months now, as Morris wrote. They found themselves on a wild, desolate part of the world, fatigued, sickly, and destitute of provisions. 4 of them perished, but Morris and 3 others clung to life by hunting and foraging. They tried to reach Buenos Aires, several hundred miles to the north, but gave up in exhaustion. One day, after 8 months of being lost in the wilderness, Morris spotted men on horses galloping towards him. I imagined nothing but death approaching, and prepared to meet it with all the resolution I could muster up. Instead of an attack, he was greeted warmly by a party of native Patagonians. They treated us with great humanity, killed a horse for us, kindled a fire, and roasted a part of it, Morris recalled. They also gave each of us a piece of an old blanket to cover our nakedness. The castaways were led from one village to another, often staying for months in one place. And in May 1744, 2.5 years after the Speedwell left them behind, 3 of the men safely reached the capital, for the Spanish to take them as prisoners. They were confined for more than a year. Finally, the Spaniards gave them permission to return home, and they were transported to Spain as prisoners in a 66-gun warship under the command of Don Jose Pizarro, the officer who had once pursued Anson's squadron. In addition to a crew of nearly 500, there were on board 11 indigenous men, including a chief named Orellana, who had been forced into slavery and made to work on the ship. Few records endure detailing the enslaved men's lives, and those that exist are filtered through the eyes of Europeans. According to the most in-depth report, which was based on the eyewitness testimony of Morris and his fellow castaways, they came from a tribe called outside Buenos Aires and had long resisted colonization. About 3 months before Pizarro's return voyage, they had been captured by Spanish soldiers. On the ship, they were treated, as the report puts it, with great insolence and barbarity. One day, Orellana was ordered to climb the mast. When he refused, an officer beat him until he was dazed and bloodied. The report stated that the officers had repeatedly lashed him and his men most cruelly on the slightest pretenses, and oftentimes only to exert their superiority. On the 3rd night of the voyage, Morris was down below when he heard a commotion coming from on deck. One of his companions wondered if a mast had fallen and rushed up a ladder to see what was happening. As he emerged, someone struck him on the back of the head, and he fell, smacking the deck. Then a body dropped beside him, that of a dead Spanish soldier. Cries rang through the ship, "A mutiny! A mutiny!" Morris also came on deck, and was amazed by what he saw. Orellana and his 10 men were storming the quarterdeck. They were vastly outnumbered, and they had no muskets or pistols, only some knives that they had covertly gathered, and a few slingshots they had fashioned from wood and cords. Yet they fought one man after another until Pizarro and several of his officers barricaded themselves in a cabin, snuffing out the lanterns and hiding in the dark. Some of the Spaniards concealed themselves amid the cattle penned upon board, whilst others scurried up the rigging and took refuge in the top of the masts. These 11 Indians, with a resolution perhaps without example, possessed themselves almost in an instant of the quarterdeck of a ship mounting 66 guns with a crew of nearly 500 men, the report noted. It was one of hundreds of documented slave rebellions and indigenous insurrections that had taken place in the Americas. True mutinies. As the historian Gilles Lepore had noted, occupied peoples had revolted again and again, asking the same questions unrelentingly: by what right are we ruled? On the Spanish ship, Orellana and his party continued to maintain control over the command center, blocking the gangplanks and resisting incursions, but they had no way to maneuver the ship and no place to go. And after more than an hour, Pizarro and his forces began to regroup. In the cabin, some men found a bucket and tied it to a long rope, which they lowered through a porthole down to the powder room, where the gunner filled it with munitions. The officers quietly pulled it upward. Once fully armed, they cracked open the cabin door, glimpsing Orellana. He had removed the western clothing he had been forced to wear and was standing nearly naked with his men, breathing in the evening air. The officers poked out the barrels of their pistols and began to fire. Sudden flashes in the darkness. A bullet hit Orellana. He staggered and fell, his blood running over the deck. This was the insurrection quelled, the report stated, and the possession of the quarterdeck regained, after it had been full 2 hours in the power of this great and daring chief and his gallant and unhappy countrymen. Orellana had been killed, and his remaining men, rather than be enslaved again, climbed onto the railings of the ship, let out defiant cries, and leapt overboard to their deaths. After Morris returned to England, he published a 48-page narrative adding to the ever-growing library of accounts about the wager affair. The authors rarely depicted themselves or their companions as the agents of an imperialist system. They were consumed with their only daily struggles and ambitions, with working the ship, with gaining promotions and securing money for their families, and ultimately with survival. But it is precisely such unthinkable complicity that allows empires to endure. Indeed, these imperial structures require it, thousands and thousands of ordinary people, innocent or not, serving and even sacrificing themselves for a system many of them rarely question. Strikingly, there was one surviving castaway who never had a chance to record his testimony in any form, not in a book or in a deposition, not even in a letter, and that was John Duck, the free black seaman who had gone ashore with Morris's abandoned party. Duck had withstood the years of deprivation and starvation, and he had managed with Morris and the two others to trek to the outskirts of Buenos Aires. But there his fortitude was of no avail, and he suffered what every free black seaman dreaded. He was kidnapped and sold into slavery. Morris didn't know where his friend had been taken, whether to the mines or to the fields. Duck's fate was unknown, as is the case for so many people whose stories can never be told. I believe he will end his days in bondage, Morris wrote, there being no prospect of his ever returning to England. Empires preserve their power with the stories that they tell, but just as critical are the stories they don't, the dark silences they impose, the pages they tear out. Meanwhile, there was already a competition underway in England to publish the definitive narrative of Anson's globe-spanning expedition. Richard Walter, the Centurion's chaplain, let it be known that he was writing such a chronicle, and the ship's schoolmaster Pasco Thomas complained that Walter was attempting to dissuade others from printing their own versions so that he could make a monopoly of this voyage. In 1745, Thomas preempted Walter by releasing a true and imperial journal of a voyage to the South Seas and round the globe in His Majesty's ship the Centurion under the command of Commodore George Anson. Another chronicle, likely polished by a Grub Street hack, hailed Anson's voyage as undoubtedly of the greatest worth and importance. In 1748, 2 years after the court-martial, Reverend Walter finally published his account, A Voyage Round the World in the Years 1740 to 44 by George Anson. At nearly 400 pages, it was the longest and most detailed of the various narratives, and it was illustrated with beautiful sketches made during an expedition by a lieutenant on the Centurion. Like many travelogues of the time, the book suffers from stilted prose and the tedious minuet of a logbook, but it successfully conveys the pulsing drama of Anson and his men confronting one disaster after another. In a brief discussion of the wager affair, the account sympathizes with Cheap, arguing that he had done his utmost to save the crew and only shot Cousins because he was the ringleader of a band of violent agitators. Walter also lent credence to the reason that none of the castaways were ever prosecuted, claiming that the men conceived that by the loss of the ship the authority of the officers was at an end. Ultimately, in Walter's hands, the sinking of the wager becomes just one more impediment in the Centurion's quest to capture the galleon. The book concludes with the stirring words, through prudence, intrepidity, and perseverance, united are not exempted from the blows of adverse fortune. In the end, they rarely fail of proving successful. But there is something odd about the book. For the work of a clergyman, it contains conspicuously little mention of God, and through the narrator writes in the first person, while describing the Centurion's engagement with the galleon. Walter was not present for this battle. He had departed from China for England shortly before the engagement. Later, sleuthing historians discovered that Walter was not the book's sole author. Much of it had been ghostwritten by a pamphleteer and mathematician named Benjamin Robbins. In fact, there was yet another hidden force behind the book, none other than Admiral Anson himself. What he admitted was an aversion to writing, and in his dispatch after capturing the galleon, he had offered little more than "I got sight of her and gave chase." Anson, however, had engineered Walter's book, providing the source materials, choosing the referent to compile it, reportedly paying Robbins £1,000 to breathe life into it and making sure that it reflected his perspective on every page. The expedition was touted as an enterprise of so very singular a nature, and Anson himself was depicted throughout as a commander who constantly exerted his utmost endeavours and always kept up his usual composure, a man who was as remarkable for his lenity and humanity as for his resolution and courage. Moreover, the book is one of the few accounts that seems deeply conscious of Britain's imperial interests, praising on the first page the country for once more demonstrating its manifest superiority over its enemies both in commerce and glory. The account was secretly Anson's version of the events, designed to burnish not only his reputation but also that of the empire. Even the book's illustration of the battle between the Centurion and the galleon, which became an iconic image, altered the dimensions of the vessel to make it look as if the galleon was the larger and more formidable of the two, rather than the other way round. The book went through one printing after another and was translated around the world, a best-selling smash in today's parlance. An official of the Admiralty noted everybody was heard of and the multitudes have read Anson's voyage around the world. The book influenced Rousseau, who in one of his novels described Anson as un capitaine, un soldat, un pilote, un sage, un grand homme. Montesquieu wrote a 40-plus page annotated summary of the book. Captain James Cook, who described Reverend Walter as the ingenious author of Lord Anson's voyage, carried a copy of on the Endeavour during his first expedition around the world, and so did Darwin on his journey on the Beagle. The book was hailed by critics and historians as a classic story of adventure, one of the pleasantest little books in the world's library, and the most popular travel book of its time. Just as people tailor their stories to serve their interests, revising, erasing, embroidering, so do nations. After all, grim and troubling narratives about the Wager disaster, and after all the death and destruction, the Empire had finally found its mythic tale of the sea. And that's the end of the final chapter. What a fascinating story, and what an outcome, and what a relief, I suppose, for all those survivors and Captain Cheap's men who'd been through some awful, awful times, being close to death on many occasions following the shipwreck of the Wager. They must have been absolutely terrible situation to be in, and to get back to England alive and be cleared by court-martial for nothing other than being present at the shipwreck of the Wager was just amazing. But what a fantastic read-through of the facts surrounding this tale of shipwreck, mutiny and murder as described by the author David Grann. I really enjoyed reading that. I hope you've enjoyed reading it with me too. I will go on and read the epilogue in a separate download, so come back for that. But if you've enjoyed reading the book with me so far, then hit that subscribe button and follow me for another story with another book, hopefully quite soon. See you later.